You know, I think that when you talk about undercover work, there's a romanticized idea behind it. Before I went into it, had that same idea. I thought that when undercover operation was approved, that, next thing you know, not just your identity, but your where you live, what you did, what you had, the car you drove, kind of fit the whole profile of the persona that you were trying to match. And, unfortunately, the reality is, yes, you're working undercover. Yes, you're engaging the bad guys. I wasn't living with the bad guys. I still went home to my own house, right? I went to my own, in this case, it was international. So I went back to my own city. And more importantly is in the 60-minute episode of whatever you're looking like CSI, it doesn't make a difference what show you're watching. What they don't show you, because it would be obscenely boring if they did, is the 3 days or 4 days worth of paperwork that I have to do for one undercover operation. Plus, they don't even talk about what precedes the undercover operation, all the paperwork that I had to do just to get the operation authorized. So if you wanted to do a show about an undercover operation that I did and do it as we're going to tell we're going to show the actual what you did, even if we did a condensed format, it would be 55 minutes of paperwork and 5 minutes of action, right?
Welcome to Podcast Wise, Perspectives, Cybersecurity, and AI. What if the same psychological tactics used by international cybercriminals to infiltrate global networks are being deployed against your executive team right now? In this episode of Podcast Wise Perspectives, I sit down with Richard LaTulip, Field CISO at Recorded Future, and former United States Secret Service Special Agent. Drawing from his time conducting covert cybercrime operations against elite hacker networks, Richard pulls back the curtain on how threat actors target the human element. He breaks down why traditional checkbox compliance fails, how to realign security strategies with business objectives, and why cultivating composure under pressure is the ultimate executive asset. Whether you are navigating board presentation dynamics or strengthening your organization's cyber resilience, this conversation delivers actionable, high-level threat intelligence you can't afford to miss. Let's dive in. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Hey, Richard.
Hello. Greetings.
Greetings. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. So I'm going to just jump right into it. So you've operated in environments where a single slip of the tongue could end a multi-year operation. In the high-pressure environment of a modern boardroom, what is that one undercover skill you find yourself using most often to gain executive buy-in?
So, I think it is calm and isolated pressure, right? I mean, if you were to compare and contrast, right, by being able to say, keep an even temperature and being able to be, let's say, thoughtful in your responses and how you do things, I want to say that resonates with people because they believe, they're looking for you to be confident and to show a level of confidence. Best example I can say is, when I was undercover, we were in Dubai and, long trips for everyone, except maybe for Maxic, right? He flew from Ukraine down to Dubai. So, but I came across the world, landed in Dubai, of course, met with him later in that evening. I thought maybe he would be tired as well. Very little interaction is what I expected. Not just meeting at my hotel room, but then going down to have dinner. And then from dinner, he invited me up to his room. And then so up in his room, we're there now on the balcony overlooking the Alberge Hotel. And now we're getting more relaxed, feels more comfortable in terms of an environment. And so questions are flowing, alcohol is flowing, you having a good time, right? And he didn't really ask a question, but I volunteered information, and I volunteered the information about my brother getting into a motorcycle accident. Well, as soon as this kind of story was being told, keyed off or clicked off a memory that he had, which we spoke online about. And so he immediately looked at me and he said, "You told me you didn't have any brothers or sisters. And now you get in that point of you've been confronted about a fact in which you've presented. Obviously, it's historical, so you have to remember what you said or didn't say. But your reaction, he's looking at you, he's judging you. And this is the same when you're in a boardroom, right? They're asking you questions. It's rapid fire sometimes. Maybe it's a little bit easier, but if you are, say, briefing them based on an incident or something that were to happen, calmness, handling pressure very well, being able to give succinct answers and informative answers, things that that they can understand. Right? Staying away from jargon is always recommended. But in this particular case, going back onto the balcony, it was almost immediate for me where I responded, well, it's of course, because I lied to you. And it kind of, turned his head to the side. He thought about it a little bit and he's like, yeah, on the internet, people lie all the time where they're, not necessarily. Now,
Yeah.
of course, I wouldn't recommend doing that in the boardroom saying I lied to you. But the point being is your answers need to flow. They need to come off. You need to be able to handle pressure. The pressure of being asked or confronted that in front of a person that you're trying to convince you're something else other than what you say you are, you can imagine the hairs in the back of your neck standing up, you getting very
Yeah.
nervous very quickly, and the fight or flight syndrome may come in and you may just want to take off. But handling it correctly, he looked at me and it resonated with him. Everyone lies online, and everyone tells unique different stories. And of course, I followed up after he's rationalizing that with, I didn't know you then, right? I didn't know you when
Right.
you told me this or you said you asked those questions. But now here we are, face to face, having these conversations, and now I'm opening up, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But handling pressure, being able, and also being prepared, right? That's to say this as well in terms of being in a boardroom is, you don't necessarily, I mean, you should know your board. You should understand, the context of what you're going in there to have a conversation about, but that doesn't mean always or that's going to be the questions, right? Those aren't
Yeah.
going to be necessarily where they go. And by the way, there's not yet a podcast that I've been on where they've given me a list of questions where we followed the script as it was laid out. And that's
Mhm.
because life takes over. I mean, any scenario that you're in, life takes over, and it kind of then sends you down different pathways. And hopefully, the end of it, right, regardless of what the plan was, you still get beneficial and usable information from it. And I think ultimately that's what the boards are looking for. I mean, they're responsible for the health of an organization. They have fiduciary responsibilities to ensure the company's trajectory and the path they're going in that direction of travel, which is encouraging to, depending on if you're publicly traded or not, but it could be the shareholders. It could be also the people who invested in you, and you still
Mhm.
may have a combination of both, even if you're publicly traded. But the point being is they want to make sure you're doing your due diligence and your due care, making sure you're managing the corporation correctly. And the board has that responsibility to ensure.
Yeah. Now, you've seen the ROI of a hacker. How should a C suite leader reevaluate their security spend based on what actually motivates a threat actor?
This is interesting, right? Because a lot of hackers are opportunistic, and when you start looking at opportunists, and this is why I'll even say the opportunistic hacker is you reverse time, you go back a little bit in the ways in the chat logs and the conversations that they had, and you think about bot herders and you think about what their role was, say like 15 years ago. 15 years ago, and maybe I always get, we're in 2026, so 15 years. Yeah, around there, right? See, 15 years ago, they were used for DDoS, they were used for phishing, they were using for those campaigns. The bigger and more stable botnet that you had, you were able to, be able to sell it for more money because the intensity of your campaign and the reach of your campaign would be fairly significant. But then an entrepreneur person came along and he said, you know what? This is an interesting situation. Right? These people literally have the toeholds that they need in order to make the initial access into a potential corporation. And so if you start thinking about it from that context, whereas that originally the computing power was used to just do DDoS or phishing, but now you have this person asking a question in this IP range, do you own any assets? Or have any access. And of course, now the bot herder in the very beginning goes and looks at his logs, he sees what he has, and he's like, I have this. And so the hacker turns to him and says, okay, good, that's great. I'll buy that space, two, three, $400. And the person's looking at it going, $500 is pretty good considering what they were getting for the entire botnet to be able to leverage that against a corporation or a company, right? And so that gave them this opportunity now to be able to say, all right, use it. And then, of course, time goes by and the headline comes out. Ransom victim pay X amount of money for whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
And so what ends up happening is, say the hacker, for example, looks and says, I know Citibank or I know this company, whatever, doesn't make a difference, is valuable and that they may be more inclined to spend money on if I capture all of their data, I can then get a bigger payout from this.
Right.
And so they see that, of course. And so sometimes though, and of course the bot herder looks back and says, well, that was the IP range that I gave to that guy, so of course that changed the dynamics there, whereas now they ended up saying, I want a percentage. This created your initial access broker opportunity, collaboration, ransomware as a service being, born not just out of this, but other areas, right? But if you look at it, how it's scaled and how it's gone through time. And so when you start looking at corporations and say, okay, my job is to create a strategy to protect an organization. The first thing I think I recommend to individuals is collaboration. You first need to understand the business. You need to have the conversations with, all the different verticals within the business. You need to understand the product. You also need to understand the direction of travel of that corporation. And you need to be able to do that not in a security kind of ideology, but in a business ideology, right? You need to talk their language. Because if you're not talking their language, then you might lose an audience very quickly. But ultimately, your strategy revolves around building the controls that you need or you've identified in collaboration with that vertical to be able to say, this is my goal. This is where we're looking to achieve. And it's important to the company. And more importantly, when you start talking about value, right? What's the value that an information security management program's bringing to a business? Well, it's the ability to allow a corporation to run uninterrupted and doing what it does, earn income, earn money, right? Build business.
Right.
This is what you're designed to do. And so you do by creating that strategy of what you have. Now, on the hacker side, sometimes these companies, like you could even say new companies that are kind of just like a lightning bolt shooting up, right? Coming out of nowhere. They may own intellectual property in which the true value has yet to be derived. If that was to
Right.
get encrypted, you know, you have major problems. Sometimes hackers don't know that. So you can think of this in saying smaller corporations that are startups that are coming up, typically obviously spend a little bit less on security than other larger corporations. That's because they're not known. And so obscurity, right? Security through obscurity is what they may be able to get away with for a period of time. But larger corporations, that's not the case. They need to be able to say, okay, well, we understand the value of our intellectual property and be able to use that to build the strategy. When you do break the, say, barriers and have the conversations with the various verticals, you're now establishing not just to yourself, but to other organizations within that company, the value of your program. And in essence, you may be able to get advocates when they're sitting there divvying out budget for the next year and you're asking for additional budget. They may come back to me and say, yeah, we appreciate what you're doing. We know that you're in the best interest of the org, and therefore the value is seen and the budget can be and the strategy can be realized.
Yeah. And have you ever heard of, so I have two questions following what you said. So one, have you heard about the branding in a box or as a service where there's a company, I believe in China, where they have all of the branding possible for one company and they sell it as a service to the hackers?
Yeah, look, various companies that I work for, the larger ones, the more challenging this is. But what comes out of China, tons of different, opportunities. And so
Mhm.
the biggest opportunity is brand. And why, right? I've talked to clients about this. I've talked to other people. I talked to conferences about this and say, you start talking about brand. If you're financial investment services and say you could be private, you could be well known, you could be not well known, it doesn't make a difference. But the point being is your clients rely on branding to drive them to where they go. And so when you start looking at it from that perspective of, say very rarely do I see persons looking at, the hovering over, say, a true link, especially one that's been embedded into whatever it is. And so they're not really looking at where does it go? Or is it possible that I take a company and I change one little aspect where I just put an I, where it could be something else, right? An F or an N. And people who quickly look at things, they just go, okay, yeah, I'm going to click the link. I'm going to go to where it is. I'm going to add my password and credentials. And then from there, once you do the add your passwords and credentials, the more sophisticated groups may give you, say, an error page, but they may then also direct you to the real place so that when you do the second add, you're adding your credentials a second time. Now you're adding it in the legitimate location,
Hmm.
and so you don't suspect anything. But coming out of China, brand in a box. I mean, I see the use case. I see it in terms of the financial investment world. I look at where in the beginning of the dark web forums in, say, 2003, 2004, and then, onward to 2009, credit card data was probably, it was initially the gold standard of opportunity for financial gain in a dark web undercover way, or in a dark web mentality. And then very quickly they started recognizing, even towards the end of when I was doing my work, they started recognizing that yes, there's value in credit cards. There's also risk in credit cards, but we're looking for the big scores. And so they started moving to investment banking. They started moving to the financial services, and they started thinking of different ways in which they need to start looking at this, because the real wealth is compromising, someone's 401k that's been sitting for 15, 20 years of just collecting money. The opportunities, of course, with Lazarus going after the crypto market and say, if I can compromise people who don't do a very good job of ensuring their crypto wallets are well secured, there's a huge opportunity here as well, given especially the rise of Bitcoin and the value derived there within. It was almost as if you would compare it to the infancy of the internet, whereas that people didn't do operational security. They didn't understand why they would need to until things started happening that were negative, right? And then they start
Yeah.
recognizing, oh, okay. Kind of the same thing with the Bitcoin, with the wallets, understanding the finances and the how-tos and the little things that matter. You're okay, well, I have this account, I have this, password word phrase, how do I secure it? It's a lot of words I don't want to write down. I'm just going to copy and paste it and put it on my computer, and I'm going to list, I mean, maybe put it as, Bitcoin, word phrase or whatever it is. It makes it easy for people because then they can find it, use it, and establish an opportunity, and then of course transfer funds. And as I think and many guests who are watching know, once that happens, good luck recovering your Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah. And my other question was, so you spoke about more so on the enterprise side. What about the small folks, like the small, mid-size businesses? The hackers, are they more like, is it more like opportunity? Like if they see like a door open, they'll just like walk in?
Well, I mean, if that ever happens, they will always walk in large.
Right.
Right? It doesn't make a difference. But to your point, I mean, I think if you look at some of the adversaries that are out there and some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they use, you'll find that small, medium-sized businesses are highly targeted. And the reason
Mhm.
is that they know oftentimes the resources and the capabilities are not as sophisticated as a large enterprise who's probably gone through multiple iterations of security, who learned a lot of different lessons and stuff. And so when you start looking at it by comparing and contrasting that small business or medium-sized business opportunity, it's almost, you use the open door terminology, but they in essence can be, an unlocked door or a door that's slightly cracked open that makes it very easy. As a matter of fact, one hacker, Roman Selesnyov, he was always out there looking for people who misconfigured, RDP or the remote opportunity, right? So log me in was that I was blanking on it for a minute. Log me in as an opportunity to remote access into a computer. And so, one of the things that he knew is tech support as well. So beyond, say, security, but tech support for small and medium sized businesses are also outsourced. And I think that if you've ever gone through the, say, hiring or bringing on an MSP or an MSSP, depending on the level that you're looking to achieve within that corporation, you'll hear sometimes that it's a 6-to-1 ratio. You'll hear a 4-to-1 ratio. It could get as high as 8-to-1. So you're saying that you have an analyst who's looking at 8 screens, so who's looking at 8 different companies. And they oftentimes, especially if you go to the IT side of it, where they're doing something very similar, they oftentimes going to be slowed down by remotely logging into all these different clients' computers. And so ultimately, that's why that session stays live. But the password credentials may be weak. The say, for example, the log me in tool that's there might be exploitable. Who knows? But I know that Roman would go into his room in his basement, wherever it was, where his computer setup was. And, he was scanning for port 3389 all night. And he would look for, all these different IP ranges using various tools, some proprietary that he knew and others that, Metasploit, for example, is a great tool to use. You don't need to do much to be able to just go out and start scanning the internet to be able to find open ports. And so he would look for those opportunities. And, come the morning time, he would come out like a champion of like, I did it, right? I found several victims and, and he compromised their networks. And what his goal was at that time was to get credit card data so that he could sell it either on the website that he operated on or alternate websites. And so you've got these multiple vectors, and oftentimes these businesses aren't super experienced. So they're
Mm.
not thinking certain areas or where vulnerabilities can persist. I mean, you look at even large corporations. I mean, one thing you would argue is that, well, small business, small problems, big places, big problems, but they spend more money on that. We can argue all day about, is it the right amount of money that they spend on that? I think most security teams would argue no, right? But the point being is, large corporations have significant problems as well because their attack surface. When you look at that attack surface and you talk about all the engineers, research and development, the teams that are working to say energize the business, most of these individuals, they're not doing anything that on its own can be said purposeful. They're doing their job in their mind, but the unintended consequences can be they create attack surface sometimes. And this attack surface can be outside of what you're looking at and where you're standing at, right? And so these create opportunities, not maliciously, unintentionally, but nonetheless, it's still the consequences. What are the consequences of something like this and it being missed?
Yeah. So it's like when you look at companies like Apple, where they have thousands of employees and all over the world working from different locations, either whether at home, at a coffee shop. Those are attack surfaces that you spoke about because they're different entry points,
Mhm.
right? And whereas a small business, there's less people, but they're also vulnerable because they're not as knowledgeable or don't have the know-how of a big company.
They may also be lacking the tools, right? They may not be using even an EDR solution.
Right.
You talk about startup businesses, sometimes it's BYOD. And before you know it, you're placing a lot of not just trust and confidence in these employees, but the devices that they're using and the type of devices that they're using. And so it even expands beyond what is the network that you're using, but also the device and what's being looked at on that device. Is it being constantly reviewed? Compliance, right? GRC, making sure you're doing the right thing all the time, using password managers, making sure you have 2FA, making sure that you are scanning all the time for viruses. So these things also are a factor. Medium
Mhm.
sized businesses, at least the way, and this isn't applicable, is an end all be all statement, but it's usually a security incident or two that happens on which they go back and say, we need to start looking at this more seriously because it can be worse, right? And you don't want the worst. So then they start slowly investing in a information security management program.
Yeah. So we often hear that humans are the weakest link. based on your social engineering experience, how can we flip that narrative to make employees a proactive sensor network?
I mean, yeah, to your point, yeah, hear it all the time, and you basically create your strategy around what you would consider to be the weakest link. The more employees that you have, the more critical it can become, but also the level of awareness. And so, how do you flip the script, and how do you, I think, improve that human layer? And awareness is one of the biggest keys. I think that currently our frameworks that we subscribe, whether you're an ISO shop or whether you're a SOC 2 or even beyond, right? It doesn't make a difference. But, the point being is most of these frameworks have an annual requirement, right? There are some that have more than an annual requirement for training. But ultimately, I think it's been a standard for a period of time that every year you'll have to sit, via whatever tool it is, for your compliance to listen to a short video. Now, do people listen to the short video or not? I mean, again, everyone will call that into question. I mean, if you talk to HR, you talk to other components in the business, especially information security, they mostly will feel that their emails go out into the ether and it sits on someone's computer. And then all of a sudden it's, number 500 in the inbox, and it never gets kind of circled back to. So, or they put the security training in the background, and then you, of course, put it on mute because you're on a call with somebody else. We've got to figure out better ways to address this as the challenges that we face. I believe that, of course, October is the Cybersecurity Awareness Month, is a great way in which a company can do this. They may wrap that up into their annual training, but we should probably look at making it more like a quarterly. We should also be incorporating it more into how we communicate with our employees, the people who are the vital components within our organization. Whereas that one click from an employee, just doing their day job, or say they got a little bit bored and they've gone off a little bit, on a break, and they're using the company computer to do online searches, but understanding what they're clicking, where they're going, and why they're doing this.
Yeah.
I think that can help and go great lengths, but it's really just the teaching. And I do believe we're getting better as a whole, where people are more aware, because quite frankly, there's more headlines than there ever has been, and there's more consequences. I think that it's risen as well, whereas a lot of these businesses, say for example, again, 15 years ago, the consequences of losing PII or PHI often just was maybe the credit card industry came to you and slapped some fines on you, but other components, data privacy aspects, they didn't really come in with the force yet. And now with GDPR and it being adopted as a standard for a lot of different new data privacy laws that are being enacted, not only do you have potentially the consequences of, say, the credit card industry, but now you have the regulatory compliance aspect where they're coming in and saying you have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that whoever's data that you're consuming or owning or using for your business purpose must be properly secured. No longer can you just write your privacy policy and put it as a link to the bottom of your website, because quite frankly, anyone that's working on a lawsuit targeting your company for the loss of that type of data will very quickly go to your privacy statements of what is it that you were saying you were doing and what
Mhm.
is it that you actually were doing, and do those match? And if they don't match, well, you've opened yourself unintentionally for legal risk.
Yeah. I think also, like, to change the security training, I think if you gamify it, right? Make it fun, make it less scary. I think that would help because everybody loves to gamify everything at this point. Uh, and I know that some individuals are a little scared of the security team, right? The relationship between the security team or the IT team to all the other departments needs to be a better relationship, I believe. Because I know that when I was doing help desk, some of the employees did not want to report that they had an issue with their computers. they waited until it was way worse than it should have been. So I was like, for me being proactive in it, I did my rounds, right? Like every day I walked around, I made sure that everybody was okay. And, they were like, hey, Tin, like, are you busy? I'm like, no, I'm not busy. I'm just doing my rounds. And they're like, oh, can you help me with this? So they felt more comfortable when I was like just walking around and trying to help anybody that had issues. Some days I didn't have nobody be like, hey, which was good. And some days there's multiple people. So I think that relationship between the IT department, security department, and the other department should have a better liaison. Like, I don't know if you watched the IT Crowd, the show IT Crowd from BBC, I believe. It's an old show, and they had a IT liaison that was doing the communications between the other team and the IT team, the IT department. So I was thinking about that they should have somebody that's able to speak both languages, like the IT language and the layman's term, and be like the in between. I don't know if that's feasible for every company, but just a thought.
No, I mean, look, you have some great points, and I'll expand a little bit further because, quite frankly, I think you're hitting on culture, and I think when you start talking about, say, the modern with remote work and the opportunities that are out there, the modern departments is diversified, not just in cultures but nationalities, and so each nationality has a little bit different way or a different approach, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't take this into account, well, you very easily can be missing the mark.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be doing that, right? So at Recording Future, one of the things that we ended up doing is recognizing this same issue you're speaking of. And then we created with different departments opportunities for lunch and learns. And so we would invite them to lunch and sit down as a team, giving them opportunities to ask questions to us, right? And then and engage at a different level as well. Whereas, yes, you can ask us questions about security and the things that we're trying to accomplish, but you also get to know us just as individuals. Like, we're not that person, lurking behind or over your shoulder, waiting for you to hit the wrong key and then jump in and go, HR,
Right.
they did a violation. They did a violation. Send them to the penalty box. So you create, to your point, right, a more personable relationship, and then it makes it easier for people to pick up the phone. Less of a fear that, okay, because I clicked that link inadvertently, the fear of, am I going to get fired? Am I going, well, like, what are the consequences? Is this suspension? Who knows what it could be, right? Because again, that beyond, say, the emails that I mentioned too, is the policies, right? Part of
Mhm.
a GRC program is to get employees to read all the policies. If 15 to 20% of the population actually read the policies, I think you're doing pretty good. 80% probably mostly just click and go, click and go, click and go. And that's also frustrating because then there more fear can be created because they're not really correlating, well, what's your responsibilities as an employee? What are the consequences? How does it tie to other policies within the organization? And how am I supposed to carry myself, right? Understanding data in terms of data labeling. You put those policies out, you let people know how they're supposed to. Now you're relying on the people to read the policy, to understand the policy, and to be able to implement it. So all of that stuff, culture is a big driving factor. Breaking down barriers and walls is, walking the office, doing that type of stuff is a great way to be able to at least bring down that temperature or that fear, and to rise that level of trust and
Yeah.
confidence. Because ultimately the IT help desk and the information security help desk, I mean, we're there to protect the company. We're there to help the employees who represent the company.
Yeah. So now speaking of culture, how does cultural awareness in the field translate to better geopolitical threat intelligence for a multinational corporation?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a little bit. I mean, I think that culture plays a huge role. I mean, there's been many, many different examples that I've used in terms of why culture is a driving factor. You can look at the BEC case that happened, not too long ago, where it got a lot of headlines, a lot of news because of out of Southeast Asia, an employee, I think it was some 20 million or thereabouts was sent out of the corporation. They used a combination of say, social engineering with AI deepfakes, and they were
Mm,
able to get this employee to do something that probably was otherwise the thing you shouldn't do, right? You look at cultures now and you say, let's add culture into it. And we look at Southeast Asia's culture, right? Hierarchy is everything. If your
right.
boss would call you and to tell you to do something, and if you took an American approach to it and be like, oh, I'm sorry, sir, I'm going to question that, and I am going to call the boss above you to confirm that what you just told me to do is what I'm supposed to do, odds are you'd be fired before the end of the day, right? If you did
Right.
that kind of say demeanor. In the US, you definitely more flexibility in the culture, questioning leadership and questioning, the direction of travel, but other cultures that doesn't necessarily work. And so this individual who ended up sending out all of that money, granted it wasn't all at once, it was over a course of time, but the point being is the chief financial officer was giving you a direction. You
Right.
don't question it, right? You do it because it could mean your job. If that was really the CFO and you question it and you didn't do what he told you to do, there are major consequences. And we're looking at an economy oftentimes where jobs aren't easy to find. And so if you have a good job that pays you well, you want to do what you can to make sure that you're following, not just following the company's guidelines or guidance, but staying in line with that culture, right? Shifting out of that region, then, Middle East has their, even India, right? All of these subcultures. And so if you bring in that multinational team, I think you can get very, complex issues. Another example, which is not cybersecurity related to it, but I lived in Estonia for 3 years. And while I lived in Estonia, a simple greeting from the United States, hey, how are you doing? What are you up to? Right. You know, no one expects an answer. No one expects you to go, oh, well, how's it going? I went to the doctor the other day. I had a procedure done. If you did that in an American style culture, they'd be like, why are you, just say all's good, move on, no big deal. In
Right.
Estonian culture, they're like, you're asking for a reason, and I'm giving you an answer because you clearly asked, and it expresses an interest. And so they feel obligated to answer that question. But for the American, it's almost as if now you're weirding me out, man. Don't be don't be giving me this much detail. But so those understanding of those cultures, it goes a
Mhm.
long way because you are like most corporations, even your medium-sized corporations, again, because of COVID, because of the hybrid nature of work and the ability now to look for talent outside of your zip code or the city in which you live in has greatly expanded. And so that's done a great thing for corporations because they can find talent that they need that addresses certain aspects that they're seeking. But then, of course, for the individual, you're now not competing against a small geographical area. Now you're competing against the globe.
Yeah. And also, we can also say that there's a cultural thing also within the United States, right? So,
Mhm.
like from the South, the New Yorkers, California, East Coast, West Coast, just different cultures within this one country. I feel like it's more so, 50 countries with territories all in one versus different states. But, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, when I lived in Estonia, it was a 3 hour drive, maybe 3 hours and some change, and I was in Latvia, in Riga, right? So from Tallinn, Estonia to Riga, and that's how short a drive was. Add another 3 hours, I was in Lithuania. A 6 hour drive from where I am here, you're in Salt Lake City, right?
Right.
You're still in the United States. You haven't. I mean, some states like Texas, if you wanted to go from tip to tip, you're talking about a day or more of travel. That. Well, I guess if you imprint Texas over Europe, I mean that's a huge, thing. I mean, and to think of it in that direction, yeah. I mean, there's multiple cultures within the American culture that
Mhm.
is unique in its own right.
Yeah. You've stated that policies pass audits, but education reduces risk. How can leaders bridge the gap between checkbox compliance and a true operational security?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a lot that goes into that question, right? Because if you think about what or where we or how have we gotten here, right? There was a time when an auditor would come in and ask the question of whether or not you had a firewall. And if you had a firewall, they would go, "Oh, whoa, yeah, you checked the box, you're good to go." And so that kind of started that whole drive towards everyone getting a firewall. And of course, then firewall changes. Do you have a SIM, right? Oh, you do. And check the box and you move along and stuff like this. Well, no one's necessarily looking deeper than that, right? And I think that you can kind of go even to cyber threat intelligence. You can literally have a feed that's given to you by CISO or that's by the FBI. And you can hand it to your auditor, and your auditor will look at it and say, "Well, that's intelligence." Well, it's not really intelligence. It's just a feed. It's just it's a piece of paper that says something about something. Intelligence is more about being, let's just say this, it's got to be timely, it's got to be actionable, and it's got to be accurate, right? Relevant. Let's use relevant as opposed to actionable, right? So, or not actionable, I'm sorry. The relevancy, right? So the relevancy, you turn it to those different key indicators and making sure that that is something that is not going to spin up a team so that they're spending their time on just anything. They're focused now on a threat that's present to their organization. And that threat persists, and that they know by the correlation of what's going on in the world, why they need to address that threat, right? So changing it from the check the box, I just got a feed, to check the box now, I've got some intelligence that's actionable that I'm working on, that's relevant to my organization. And it came to me in time, right? So I know what I'm doing. And so what else does that matter, right? So if you look at frameworks, most frameworks, if you were to say, I would look at your SOC 2 report, and even if it was a complete clean bill of health, now I have to look at the dates. When was that done? Because remember, all of these things are point in time exercises.
Yeah.
They're not continuous. And so I think it changed from, say, the point in time operation to a continuous monitoring model is definitely a more secure state for an organization. You do see organizations moving in that direction, but ultimately the SOC 2 audit that's been done 8 months ago gives me no guarantee that any of the controls that they looked at that point in time are still managed in the state that they were looked at 8 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
I just have
Yeah.
kind of a little bit of a, warmer and fuzzier feeling that at least you had someone come through and look at certain controls and verify that those controls. I would be more happy if you were to tell me that you're using certain tools that were continually reviewing your current state and popping off those alerts, not just say, the SIM going off, but making sure that employees are, the onboarding and offboarding of our employees are done correctly. That the 2FA is being used across the board as it should be. That the tools in which you have in terms of the expansion, someone adds a new S3 bucket to your AWS environment. Did he click the button non-public? Or is that intentional? Maybe it's supposed to be public. But the point being is you want to make sure that what is being done is as per your policies, and that it's being consistently done across the board. And you're checking to make sure that, the encrypted button is checked, to make sure that the services that you have providing security are working as they're supposed to be designed, to make sure that those pieces of data that are being stored in those critical buckets, whether you're using Azure or AWS, I just use those by example, but making sure that those are as secure as they can be or should be as per our policy. And if they're not by our policy, that we're getting the proper exceptions, and we're using our change management program to be able to be sure that what we're doing is the correct way to do things.
Okay. That's a lot. I'm like sitting here, I'm like, okay, that's a lot of check marks, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, the check the box thing, like I said, I mean, the biggest one today I see, because mostly I am working in intelligence, is most organizations are checking the box for intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
not getting true intelligence. And so, but that's relatable to, let's look at it this way. There was a company that installed, and this is just a story, by the way, and there's probably many stories like this, but they installed the firewall, but they never did anything in terms of the settings. And they passed the audit because they had a firewall.
Yeah.
Basically, the one rule that applied to it was allow an NA, right? Because it works, right? Allow it. If you have that rule, your firewall works, and no one from sales or marketing is complaining to you. And they're yes, the internet works, but you gain no security, but you have a security tool. That if you have continued compliance and you had that firewall being reviewed, you would say, well, what's my policy really doing? Nothing.
Yeah. So it's basically like buying cameras for the house and just not turning it on.
Yeah. Having or not locking them.
Yeah.
There's tons of analogies that you can use.
Yeah. So in your time in undercover, what was the most effective psychological hook used by criminal that enterprise leaders should be training their staff to recognize today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is let's just say and they know this too. So it's very challenging to be able, things that we do today often lend weight to opportunities. Why do I say that? Think about this. In terms of LinkedIn, everyone's using LinkedIn as an opportunity. And what do we do on LinkedIn? Of course, we put the job, we put our experience, we put our opportunities, we put our colleagues, we do all this stuff, right? Add
Uh-huh.
AI into the mix. Now I can take AI and basically target Richard LaTulip and say, look at your LinkedIn profile and give me a deep dive analysis of what contacts he has and how many of them are with recorded future. And then you can start saying, okay, well, he knows all these different people. And so now then you can do, okay, let's look at the web in this particular content and other content that's going to be out there. Now we can start looking at the content. We can start getting a site picture alignment of who the person is. And so you start looking at the opportunity for social engineering. I know from your profile that you engage with, say, your CFO or your CEO or whomever the C-suite person is. So now if I want to go to help desk, I could very easily use a lot of data out there to help me to create deep fakes. I can also use advanced other techniques of, say, help desk techniques. So I can even get you to be a victim of your own, say, scheme to defraud the corporation by using you unwittingly. And so ultimately, this goes back to that awareness and goes back to the questioning. I remember when I was with the Secret Service and I cold called somebody and was doing an investigation, and I started asking some questions. And of course, rightfully, they were skeptical of the whole thing. And they said to me, how do I know that you're Secret Service just because you're saying you're Secret Service? It seems really odd that you're calling me. Plus, no one really correlated financial crimes to the Secret Service anyways. So that was another hill that I had to climb and get over. But ultimately, it came down to the question of my identity. Who are you and why would I answer these questions? Even though you've said that you're Secret Service. I said, you're absolutely right. There's no way that you know we've never met each other. So I don't know you and you don't know me. And so ultimately, what do you want to do here? Right. You can come down to the office and we can talk face to face. No, I don't want to do that. He's like, why don't you just give me a number and I can call that number to verify that you are who you say you are. I'm like, well, here's the deal. I'm not going to give you any number because if I give you a number, what do you think I would be giving to you if I wasn't a Secret Service agent? I'd give you a number that I already know is a number that you should use and that would verify who I am 100%. So here's the deal. Go out to the, yellow pages if you'd like, or on the internet. The internet was there, right? You could still use it. Thanks to Al Gore, we have that resource. And so ultimately, you need to do that. Find the data, call the office, verify that I work there. And by the way, once they verify you work, I'm in the office so they can just, connect you to me
Transfer.
and we'll go forward. And the guy's like, it's so much work. What do you want to know?
Yeah.
That's the level of things that we have to do sometimes that we have to start questioning. You get an email that you didn't expect, right? If it's internal, it's on your email chain, right? So ultimately companies, I definitely encourage this. The banners, I know that they can be a little bit annoying. I know they can be a little bit intrusive, but that banner that comes across outside email, be careful what you click, because when someone impersonates, especially when they spoof the domains, you can get a very similar looking domain, but if it's coming from outside with that similar domain, now you get the banner that says, no, you need to be a little bit, you scrutinize this email. And so you should be doing that a lot of times because, I talked about the business email compromise opportunity.
Mhm.
These guys, sometimes when I'm talking about these guys, the criminals can be sitting on your network, watching your emails going back and forth, and they'll see when you're going to do that deal and they can intercept it at the right time. All they do is change the banking information they forward on. You
Yeah.
get that. Oh, it's a new banking, whatever, send the money. So you need to be very careful. You need to be a little bit more scrutinizing certain things, certain aspects. And we should understand the problem though, or an area where I see that there needs to be assistance, a lot of assistance is, I think, again, backing to culture in the United States, we by default are very trusting,
Hmm.
and that same nature and helpful, right? We want to be helpful and we want to be trusting, and so those two things in its own right, it's a perfect recipe for advanced phishing techniques to work
Yeah.
because we're already, say, prescribed to not just click the button, but how can I help you? How can I make the problem go away? That's what I want to do. And so we need to add a little bit more of a questioning aspect into our culture.
Being a little bit more suspicious.
With all that's going on and all the different advanced social engineering techniques, with all the deep fakes getting better and better and better. I mean, we are limited in choices because I think earlier we talked about that, right? The human
Hmm.
layer. The most important aspects to any organization is its people. What can become the weakest link to any organization is its people.
Yeah. All right. So I have one more question for you, and is after years of living under an alias, what was the most difficult part of transitioning back to the authentic self in the corporate world?
Yeah, I mean, I never left, in terms of, there was no out of body experience. I mean, you know, I think that when you talk about undercover work, there's a romanticized idea behind it.
Mm.
Before I went into it, had that same idea. I thought that when undercover operation was approved, that, next thing you know, not just your identity, but your where you live, what you did, what you had, the car you drove, kind of fit the whole profile of the persona that you were trying to match. And, unfortunately, the reality is, yes, you're working undercover. Yes, you're engaging the bad guys. I wasn't living with the bad guys. I still
Mm.
went home to my own house, right? I went to my own, well, in this case, it was international. So I went back to my own city. And more importantly, is in the 60-minute episode of whatever you're looking, like CSI, it doesn't make a difference what show you're watching. What they don't show you, because it would be obscenely boring if they did, is the 3 days or 4 days worth of paperwork that I have to do for one undercover operation. Plus, they don't even talk about what precedes the undercover operation, all the paperwork that I had to do just to get the operation authorized. So if you wanted to do, a show about an undercover operation that I did and do it as we're going to tell we're going to show the actual what you did, even if we did a condensed format, it would be 55 minutes of paperwork and 5 minutes of action, right?
Yeah, I
That
can
that
imagine.
would that would be what it would be, right? And so in the book that I wrote, I try to kind of, I don't go, I want to keep it exciting for the reader, things that we're doing, but I also didn't want to gloss over, the challenges that you do or you can face while working undercover. There's a personal consequence that comes with it. There's a professional consequences that comes with it. And so because of that, the story needed to be told, and that's why I told it. But to go from, say, Richard Druck, the undercover agent, to Richard LaTulip, the agent that worked for the U.S. Secret Service, or today's current role at Recorded Future, it was easy for me because I was only in role when I needed to be in role, and then the
Mm.
majority of the time it was completely just being you. And the Secret Service, during the time that I was working this mission, we were not super experienced at doing undercover operations. And so we were doing a lot of things on the fly. We were kind of, building it as we did it. And so if you can imagine doing an undercover operation and then being sent off to do a protective operation, that's how it kind of worked. And so in order to survive, so to speak, I intertwined everything. Think of like a rope. Let's, like rolled through it. And so my undercover life partly was mimicking my real world life. I
Mm.
changed names, I changed locations, I changed certain aspects of it, but it wasn't as if I did a complete, hey guys, it was nice working with you. I'll see you when the operation's over, and there'll be limited contact through secret channels.
Right.
I got the operation. I just briefed my supervisors almost contemporaneous to the operation.
Well, Richard, I thank you so much for joining me today. It was a great conversation, very interesting. So thank you.
Oh,
And
thank you
thank you
for
to
having
the,
me.
of course, of course. And thank you to the Wise crew for joining us and taking a listen. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you.